The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I stared at the official documents through my kitchen window as Simon loaded the last of his belongings into Paul's truck. My 8-year-old daughter Ava pressed against my side, asking why Daddy wasn't coming back inside. How did it come to this? How did my marriage of 10 years collapse so completely that my husband could walk away without a single backward glance? The answer lies in a series of choices I made, starting with one fateful afternoon when I invited Felix Mason into the bed I shared with my husband. It started innocently enough, or at least that's what I told myself. Simon had been working late again, buried in spreadsheets and tax documents that seemed more important than our marriage. He'd come home at 9:30, eat reheated dinner in silence, and fall asleep watching the news. We hadn't had a real conversation in months, let alone anything resembling intimacy. "Mom, why does Dad always look so tired?" Ava asked one evening, her small face scrunched with concern as Simon trudged upstairs without saying goodnight. "He's just busy with work, sweetheart," I replied, but inside I was seething. Busy with work, busy with his mother's constant phone calls, busy with everything except me. That's when Felix entered the picture. I'd met him at Maya's birthday party 3 months earlier. He was the bartender at her favorite restaurant, all easy smiles and genuine interest in what I had to say. When he asked for my number, claiming he wanted to continue our conversation about art, I gave it to him without hesitation. The texting started innocently. Felix would send me pictures of paintings he'd seen, or articles about local gallery openings. He remembered that I'd studied art history in college, something Simon had forgotten years ago. Felix made me feel interesting again, intelligent, desired. "You have such sophisticated taste," he texted one afternoon while I sat in my office cubicle, processing insurance claims. "I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on Impressionism." I found myself checking my phone constantly, smiling at messages that had nothing to do with grocery lists or parent-teacher conferences. For the first time in years, someone was paying attention to me as a woman, not just as Simon's wife or Ava's mother. The first time I invited Felix over, Simon was attending a weekend accounting seminar in Chicago. I told myself it was just coffee, just a friendly conversation between two adults who appreciated art. Ava was at her friend's house for a sleepover, so the house was empty except for us. Felix arrived at 2 in the afternoon, carrying a bouquet of sunflowers and wearing that easy smile that made my stomach flutter. "For the lady of the house," he said, and I felt 17 again. We did talk about art initially. We sat in my living room, drinking coffee and discussing the upcoming Monet exhibition downtown. But, as the afternoon wore on, the conversation shifted. Felix asked about my marriage, my dreams, whether I felt fulfilled. "Simon's a good provider," I heard myself saying, "but sometimes I feel invisible, like I'm just part of the furniture." "A woman like you should never feel invisible," Felix replied, moving closer on the couch. "You're vibrant, intelligent, beautiful. Any man would be lucky to have your attention." When he kissed me, I didn't pull away. When he suggested we move to somewhere more comfortable, I led him upstairs to the master bedroom, to the bed I shared with my husband of 10 years. Afterward, as Felix dozed beside me, I stared at the ceiling and felt a mixture of exhilaration and guilt. The guilt was easier to push away than I'd expected. Simon had been neglecting me for years, taking me for granted, treating me like a roommate rather than a wife. Didn't I deserve to feel desired? Didn't I deserve happiness? I was in the shower, washing away the evidence of my afternoon, when I heard the garage door open. My heart stopped. Simon wasn't supposed to be home until Sunday evening. "Ligeia," his voice called from downstairs. "I'm home early, the seminar was cancelled." I threw on my robe and rushed to the bedroom, where Felix was frantically pulling on his clothes. "You need to go," I whispered urgently. "Now." Felix slipped out the back door while I changed the sheets with shaking hands. By the time Simon came upstairs, I was dressed in fresh clothes, the bedroom windows open to air out any lingering scent. "How was your day?" Simon asked, setting down his overnight bag. His eyes swept the room, and I wondered if he could sense that something was different. "Quiet," I replied, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "I caught up on some reading, did some cleaning. The usual." Simon nodded, already reaching for his laptop. "I need to review some files for Monday. The Henderson account is more complicated than I thought." As he settled into his home office, I deleted Felix's messages and cleared my call history. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Simon's glance had lingered a moment too long on the freshly made bed, on my damp hair, on the sunflowers I'd hastily shoved into a vase. That night, as Simon slept beside me, I replayed every moment with Felix. The way he'd looked at me like I was the most fascinating woman in the world. The way he'd touched me with reverence and passion. For 3 hours, I'd felt alive again. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a moment of weakness that wouldn't happen again. But even as I made that promise, I was already planning when I could see Felix next. 3 weeks later, I found myself sitting across from Maya at our favorite cafe, desperately needing to talk to someone about what I'd done. Maya had always been the adventurous one in our friendship, the one who encouraged me to live a little whenever I complained about my mundane married life. "You look different," Maya observed, stirring sugar into her latte. "Happier. Did you finally take my advice and book that spa weekend?" I glanced around the cafe, making sure no one was listening, then leaned forward. "I did something," I said quietly. "Something I probably shouldn't have done." Maya's eyes lit up with interest. "Tell me everything." "I can't give you details," I said, though part of me was dying to share every moment. "But let's just say I've been reminded that I'm still an attractive woman with needs." "Ligeia," Maya gasped, but she was grinning. "Are you telling me you had an affair?" "Shh," I looked around nervously. "It's not an affair, it was just a moment of connection with someone who actually sees me." Maya reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Good for you. Simon's been taking you for granted for years. Maybe this will shake things up, remind him what he has." "I don't know if I should tell him," I admitted. "Part of me thinks he wouldn't even care." "Don't tell him anything," Maya said firmly. "Men like Simon don't deserve explanations. They deserve to wonder why their wives are suddenly glowing." Her words were exactly what I needed to hear. Maya understood. She'd seen how Simon treated me at parties, how he'd dismiss my opinions or interrupt me mid-sentence to talk about work. She'd witnessed years of small humiliations that had chipped away at my self-esteem. That evening, I called my mother to test the waters further. Helen Price had never been Simon's biggest fan, though she'd grudgingly admitted he was a good provider. "You sound chipper," Mum observed. "Is everything okay with Simon's work situation?" "Everything's fine," I said carefully. "Actually, I've been thinking about our conversation last month, about marriage requiring more than just financial stability." "Oh?" Mum's voice sharpened with interest. "Have you two been talking about counseling?" "Not exactly," I said, "but I've been realizing that I deserve to feel appreciated, valued, desired." There was a pause. "Ligeia, you're not thinking of doing something foolish, are you?" "Of course not," I lied smoothly. "I'm just saying that marriage should be a partnership where both people feel fulfilled." "Well, yes," Mum agreed slowly. "But Simon isn't a bad husband. He's just practical. Some women would kill for that kind of stability." After hanging up, I felt a flicker of doubt. Was I being ungrateful? Simon had never cheated, never raised his voice, never failed to pay the bills or show up for Ava's school events. But he'd also never made me feel like the most important person in his world. Felix, on the other hand, sent me poetry. Real poetry that he'd written himself, comparing my eyes to autumn leaves and my laugh to music. When was the last time Simon had said anything romantic to me? I couldn't remember. The doubt evaporated when Simon came home that night and barely acknowledged my new dress. I'd bought it specifically to see if he'd notice, spent an hour on my hair and makeup. He glanced up from his phone long enough to ask if there was any leftover pasta, then returned to his emails. "How was your day?" I asked, sitting beside him on the couch. "Busy," he replied without looking up. "The Morrison audit is next week, and their books are a disaster." "I had lunch with Maya today," I offered. "She mentioned that her friend Felix is having an art show downtown. I thought maybe we could go this weekend." Simon finally looked at me, and something flickered in his eyes. "Felix?" "The bartender from her birthday party. You met him briefly." "Right." Simon's voice was neutral, but his gaze lingered on my face. "I don't think I can make it this weekend. Too much work." "Of course," I said, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "Work always comes first." "It's temporary," Simon said, but he was already looking back at his phone. "Once tax season is over, things will calm down." It was the same promise he'd been making for years. After tax season, after the Henderson account, after the Morrison audit. There was always something more important than our marriage. That night, as I lay awake, listening to Simon's steady breathing, I made a decision. If my husband couldn't be bothered to notice me, perhaps it was time to stop feeling guilty about finding attention elsewhere. I reached for my phone and typed a message to Felix. "The art show sounds wonderful. Would you like some company this weekend?" His response came within minutes. "I'd love nothing more. You make everything more beautiful just by being there." I smiled in the darkness, feeling desired and appreciated for the first time in months. Simon stirred beside me, and for a moment I wondered if I should wake him, try one more time to bridge the growing distance between us. But then he mumbled something about quarterly reports in his sleep, and I knew my answer. 2 months into my relationship with Felix, I decided to test the boundaries of my secret. Simon's birthday was approaching, and I'd planned a small dinner party with family and close friends. On impulse, I invited Felix, telling Simon he was Maya's friend who'd helped with the catering arrangements. "I don't really know him," Simon said when I mentioned Felix would be joining us. "Isn't it a bit odd to invite a stranger to a family dinner?" "He's not a stranger," I replied, arranging flowers in the dining room. "He's Maya's friend, and he's been incredibly helpful with planning. Besides, we need even numbers for the table." Simon studied my face for a long moment. "If you think it's appropriate." The night of the party, I spent extra time getting ready. I wore the black dress that Felix had complimented, the one that made my waist look tiny and showed just enough cleavage to be interesting. When Simon saw me, he nodded approvingly but didn't say anything. When Felix arrived and his eyes widened with genuine appreciation, I felt vindicated. "You look absolutely stunning," Felix murmured when I greeted him at the door. "Simon's a lucky man." "Thank you," I replied, letting my hand linger on his arm as I took his coat. "You clean up pretty well yourself." The dinner started normally enough. My mother had brought her famous lasagna, Doris had made Simon's favorite chocolate cake, and Paul regaled us with stories from his latest business trip. But as the evening progressed, I found myself gravitating toward Felix, laughing a little too loudly at his jokes, touching his shoulder when I passed behind his chair. "Felix was just telling me about his art," I announced during dessert. "He has such an interesting perspective on modern impressionism." "Oh?" Simon's voice was carefully neutral. "Are you an artist, Felix?" "I dabble," Felix replied modestly. "Ligeia has been incredibly encouraging. She has such a sophisticated understanding of artistic technique." I beamed at the compliment, missing the way Simon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "How nice that you two have found common ground," Doris said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "It's so important for wives to have intellectual stimulation." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Maya quickly changed the subject to Ava's upcoming school play, but I caught the look that passed between Simon and his mother. After dinner, while the others moved to the living room, I lingered in the kitchen with Felix, ostensibly to wrap leftovers. "This is torture," Felix whispered, standing close enough that I could smell his cologne. "Watching you play hostess when all I want to do is kiss you." "Felix," I warned, but I didn't step away. "Not here." "Then when?" His hand brushed mine as he handed me a plate. "It's been 2 weeks since we've been alone together." "Soon," I promised, glancing toward the doorway. "Simon has a conference next month." "Ligeia." Simon's voice made me jump. He stood in the doorway, watching us with unreadable eyes. "Do you need help in here?" "Just finishing up," I said brightly, stepping away from Felix. Felix was telling me about his latest painting. Simon nodded slowly. "Paul's getting ready to leave. He wanted to say goodbye." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite farewells and thank yous. Felix shook Simon's hand warmly, thanking him for his hospitality, and I walked him to the door while Simon said goodbye to his family. "Your husband seems like a nice guy," Felix said quietly. "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure about you," I replied, surprising myself with the honesty of the statement. After everyone left, I expected Simon to comment on the evening, perhaps mention how helpful Felix had been, or how much my mother had enjoyed his stories. Instead, he quietly loaded the dishwasher while I put away leftovers. "Good party," he said finally. "I thought so too. Everyone seemed to have fun." Simon dried his hands on the kitchen towel, then turned to face me. "Your friend Felix seems very attentive." "He's just friendly," I said, but something in Simon's tone made me defensive. Not everyone communicates through spreadsheets and tax codes. "No," Simon agreed quietly. "Some people communicate through other means entirely." Before I could ask what he meant by that, he announced he was going to spend the night at his mother's house. She mentioned wanting help with her computer, and it's getting late. "On your birthday?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "It's just one night, Ligeia. I'll be back tomorrow." But as I watched him pack an overnight bag, something felt different about his departure. Usually when Simon stayed at his mother's, he'd kiss me goodbye, remind me to set the alarm, ask if I needed anything from the store. This time, he simply picked up his keys and left. I stood in our empty house, surrounded by the detritus of the party, and felt a strange mix of triumph and unease. I'd successfully brought Felix into my home, into Simon's space, and my husband had suspected nothing. So why did I feel like I'd just made a terrible mistake? The signs were subtle at first. Simon started working even later than usual, often not coming home until after Ava's bedtime. When I asked about his schedule, he'd cite new clients or complicated audits, but something in his tone suggested there was more to it. "Dad's never home anymore," Ava complained one evening, as I helped her with homework. "Is he mad at us?" "Of course not, sweetheart," I assured her, though privately I was wondering the same thing. "He's just busy with work." But it wasn't just the late nights. Simon had become meticulously careful about everything. He'd always been organized, but now he documented everything. Grocery receipts, gas station visits, even coffee purchases. He'd started taking photos of the house before he left for work, claiming it was for insurance purposes after a colleague's break-in. "You're being paranoid," I told him, when I caught him photographing our bedroom. "We live in a safe neighborhood." "Better safe than sorry," he replied, but his eyes lingered on the unmade bed in a way that made me uncomfortable. Meanwhile, my relationship with Felix was intensifying. We'd progressed from coffee dates to long lunches to afternoon meetings at his apartment. He'd given me a key, claiming he wanted me to feel comfortable using his place as a retreat whenever I needed space. "You deserve so much more than what you're getting at home," Felix would tell me as we lay tangled in his sheets. "A woman like you should be worshipped, not ignored." His words were intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt beautiful, desired, important. When Felix looked at me, I saw myself reflected as someone worth pursuing, worth risking everything for. I started using our joint credit card to buy Felix gifts: art supplies, expensive wine, a vintage watch he'd admired in a shop window. When Simon questioned the charges, I had ready explanations. The art supplies are for Ava's school project, I'd say. The wine is for your mother's birthday dinner. The watch, I returned it. The refund should show up next month. Simon would nod and make notes in his little black book, the one he'd started carrying everywhere. I assumed he was tracking expenses for tax purposes, but something about his methodical record-keeping made me nervous. "You're documenting everything these days," I observed one evening, as he photographed a receipt. "The IRS is cracking down on audits," he replied without looking up. "I want to make sure we have documentation for every expense." It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't explain why he'd started password protecting his computer, or why he'd changed the security settings on our home Wi-Fi network. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Simon had told me he'd be working late, so I'd invited Felix over. We were in the master bedroom when I heard the garage door open. "He's home early," I whispered, panic flooding my system. "You need to hide." Felix grabbed his clothes and ducked into the walk-in closet while I threw on my robe and ran to the bathroom, turning on the shower to explain why I was undressed in the middle of the afternoon. "Ligeia," Simon called from downstairs. "I'm in the shower," I called back. "I'll be down in a minute." I heard his footsteps on the stairs, then the bedroom door opening. Through the bathroom door, I could see him standing in the doorway, surveying the room. His gaze lingered on the rumpled bedsheets, the wine glasses on the nightstand, the men's watch on my dresser. "Whose watch is this?" he asked when I emerged from the bathroom. My mind raced. "It's yours," I said quickly. "I found it in the laundry room and brought it up here." Simon picked up the watch, examining it carefully. "This isn't mine, Ligeia. I've never seen this watch before." "Then maybe it's Paul's," I said, wrapping my robe tighter around myself. "He was here last weekend, remember? He probably left it when he used our bathroom." Simon stared at me for a long moment, then carefully placed the watch back on the dresser. "I'll ask him about it." After Simon left for his mother's house, another sudden overnight visit, Felix emerged from the closet, shaken and pale. "This is getting too dangerous," he said, pulling on his shirt. "What if he'd opened the closet door?" "He didn't," I replied, but my hands were trembling as I changed the sheets. "He doesn't suspect anything." "Are you sure about that?" Felix asked. Because from where I was hiding, it sounded like he was asking some pretty pointed questions about my watch. I wanted to reassure him, to convince both of us that Simon was just being his usual meticulous self. But as I watched my husband's car disappear down the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. That night, alone in the house, I went through Simon's desk looking for clues about his recent behavior. What I found made my blood run cold. A manila folder labeled documentation containing photos, receipts, and a detailed timeline of my activities over the past 2 months. He knew. Simon knew everything. The confrontation I'd been dreading came at the worst possible moment, during parent-teacher conferences at Ava's school. Simon had been absent from family events for 2 weeks, claiming work emergencies and client meetings. I'd grown comfortable explaining his absence, painting myself as the dedicated single parent holding everything together. Mrs. Carruthers, Ava's teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, said as I settled into the tiny plastic chair across from her desk, "I wanted to discuss some concerns about Ava's recent behavior." "What kind of concerns?" I asked, though I suspected I knew. Ava had been clingy lately, asking repeatedly when Daddy was coming home. "She's been having trouble concentrating, and she's mentioned that there's been tension at home. She's worried about her father, says he seems sad all the time." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "My husband has been working very hard lately. It's temporary." "Of course," Ms. Rodriguez said diplomatically. "We just want to make sure Ava feels supported during this difficult time." Difficult time? I bristled at the implication that our family was in crisis. "I think you're reading too much into a busy work period," I said coolly. As I left the classroom, I nearly collided with Doris Carruthers in the hallway. Simon's mother looked older than her 62 years, her face drawn with worry, and something that looked suspiciously like anger. "Ligeia," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the crowded hallway. "How convenient to find you here. I was just wondering where my son has been living for the past 2 weeks." Other parents turned to look at us, their conversations trailing off as they sensed drama unfolding. I forced a smile, trying to project normalcy. "Simon's been staying with you," I said quietly. "You know that." "Yes, I do know that," Doris replied, her voice growing louder. "What I don't know is why a married man with a child feels the need to sleep on his mother's couch instead of in his own bed." "Doris, please," I whispered, acutely aware of the audience we'd attracted. "This isn't the place." "Isn't it?" she asked. "Because it seems to me that this is exactly the place to discuss why Ava's father isn't living at home anymore. Why he comes to my house every night looking like a broken man. Why he spends his evenings gathering evidence instead of watching TV with his family." The word evidence hit me like a physical blow. Several parents were now openly staring, including Maya's neighbor Jennifer, who I knew would spread this conversation throughout our social circle within hours. "I don't know what Simon has told you," I began, but Doris cut me off. "He hasn't told me anything," she snapped. "He doesn't need to. I have eyes, Ligeia. I can see what's happening to my son, even if he's too much of a gentleman to spell it out." "Mrs. Carruthers?" Ms. Rodriguez had appeared beside us, clearly uncomfortable with the public confrontation. "Perhaps you'd like to continue this conversation somewhere more private." "No need," Doris said, gathering her purse. "I've said what I came to say." She turned back to me, her eyes blazing with protective fury. "My son deserves better than this, Ligeia, and so does my granddaughter." As Doris walked away, I stood frozen in the hallway, surrounded by whispers and curious stares. Jennifer approached with false sympathy painted on her face. "Is everything okay?" she asked, though her eyes were bright with gossip-hungry interest. "You look upset." "Everything's fine," I managed. "Just family stress. You know how it is." But even as I said the words, I knew nothing was fine. The careful facade I'd built was crumbling, and I had no idea how to stop it. The next morning, Maya called with barely concealed excitement in her voice. "Jennifer posted on Facebook about some drama at the school last night," she said. "Something about you and Simon's mother having a public argument." "It wasn't an argument," I protested. "Doris was just being dramatic. You know how she gets." "Ligeia," Maya's voice grew serious. "People are starting to talk. Jennifer's implying that you and Simon are having marriage problems, and she's hinting that there might be someone else involved." My stomach dropped. "What exactly did she say?" "Nothing specific, but you know how these things work. Once people start speculating—" Maya trailed off. "Maybe you should be more careful about your friendship with Felix, at least until things calm down." The word war echoed in my head long after the door shut. Not because Simon had raised his voice or threatened me, but because of the tone he'd used. Quiet, resolved, stripped of the hesitation I'd relied on for years. That tone didn't ask to be negotiated with. It announced intent. I stood there in the hallway, listening to the faint sound of his footsteps fade down the stairs, and felt the house tilt. This wasn't like our other arguments, the ones that ended with silence and avoidance, and an unspoken agreement to pretend nothing had happened. This was different. This was movement. I went back into the kitchen and sat down heavily at the table, staring at the faint ring a coffee mug had left behind. Felix's coffee mug. He'd been here that morning, confident and easy, leaning against the counter like he belonged there, joking about how empty the place felt lately. At the time, his presence had felt like relief. Now it felt like evidence. The phone rang again. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Simon's sister. She'd always been polite, distant, observant, the kind of woman who stored information quietly until it became useful. "Ligeia," she said when I answered. No greeting, no warmth. "I won't take much of your time." "I'm sure you won't," I replied, my voice tight. People are talking, she said simply, about you, about Felix, about how often he's been around since Simon moved out. That's none of your business, I snapped. It becomes my business when it affects my brother, she replied evenly, and when it affects his reputation. My reputation? I laughed bitterly. What about his? He left. He moved out. He let everyone assume the worst about me. There was a pause. Did he assume wrong? I closed my eyes. For a moment, just a moment, I considered telling her everything. Telling someone, anyone, the whole truth so I wouldn't have to carry it alone anymore. But I knew better. Confessions weren't absolution, they were ammunition. Simon and I are adults, I said carefully. Our marriage issues are private. They stopped being private when Felix became a fixture in your life, she replied. I'm calling you as a courtesy. Simon is done protecting you. The line went dead. I sat there, heart pounding, and finally admitted what I'd been dancing around all day. I wasn't losing Simon because of one mistake or one bad argument. I was losing him because the version of me he'd trusted no longer existed, and because I'd underestimated how much damage silence could do once it broke. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine I didn't want and opened my laptop. Not to work, to search. Divorce timelines, asset division, custody precedents. The words blurred together, each result more sobering than the last. Simon wasn't bluffing. He was preparing, methodically, just like he did with everything else. A message popped up on my screen. Felix, heard things are getting messy. You okay? I stared at the text, waiting for the familiar rush. It didn't come. Instead, irritation flared. Messy, as if this were a minor inconvenience, a spilled drink someone else would clean up. You shouldn't text me right now, I typed back. A few seconds passed. Then, did he find out? I hesitated. Honesty now felt pointless, even dangerous. It's complicated, I wrote. That was apparently the wrong answer. I didn't sign up to be the bad guy here, Felix replied. If this turns into drama, I'm out. The words stung more than I expected. Not because I loved him. If I was honest, I wasn't sure I ever had. But because they confirmed something ugly. I'd risked everything for a man who could walk away without losing much at all. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, suddenly exhausted. Simon had been right. I'd been managing compartments, convincing myself that as long as no single wall collapsed, the whole structure would stand. I hadn't accounted for what happened when the walls started talking to each other. The next morning, an email arrived from a law firm I recognized. Polite, professional, unmistakable. Simon had moved quickly, faster than I'd ever seen him move in our marriage. I printed it out and placed it on the counter, next to Felix's abandoned mug. 2 paths, laid out plainly. One built on patience and loyalty I'd dismissed as dull. One built on excitement that evaporated the moment consequences appeared. I thought about Simon at the beginning, how steady he'd been, how unremarkable that steadiness had seemed until now. How I'd mistaken predictability for weakness, calm for complacency. I'd wanted intensity. What I'd gotten instead was chaos. That afternoon, I packed away the last of Simon's things myself, not because he'd asked, but because I couldn't bear seeing them scattered around like ghosts. Each folded shirt felt like an admission, each empty drawer, a verdict. When I was done, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room that no longer felt shared. This was the war Simon had declared, not with shouting or accusations, but with action, with boundaries, with the refusal to play the role I'd assigned him. And for the first time since I'd started telling myself stories about freedom and desire and self-discovery, I understood the real cost. Wars aren't loud at the beginning. They start quietly, with doors closing, lawyers calling, and the slow, irreversible realization that the person you thought you could always outmaneuver has finally stopped playing. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a process server who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I signed for them with shaking hands, my coffee growing cold as I read through the devastating litany of charges Simon's lawyer had compiled: adultery, financial mismanagement, emotional abandonment of parental duties. The legal language was clinical, but the evidence attached was damning. Photos of Felix leaving our house, credit card statements showing gifts I'd bought him, text messages I thought I'd deleted, even security camera footage from our neighbor's house showing Felix's car in our driveway on multiple occasions when Simon was supposedly at work. My hands trembled as I flipped through page after page of documentation. Simon had been methodical in his evidence gathering, patient in his surveillance. The husband I'd dismissed as boring and inattentive had quietly built an airtight case against me. The custody petition was the cruelest blow. Simon was seeking primary custody of Ava, citing my unstable behavior and compromised judgment. He'd documented every late night, every lie I'd told about working overtime, every time I'd left Ava with babysitters so I could meet Felix. I called Maya immediately, but her phone went straight to voicemail. When I tried her again an hour later, she answered with obvious reluctance. "I can't talk long," she said before I could speak. "I'm at work." "Maya, I need your help. Simon's filing for divorce and he's trying to take Ava away from me." There was a long pause. "Ligeia, I think maybe you should talk to a lawyer instead of me." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I don't want to get involved in legal proceedings. This whole situation has gotten way out of hand." "You're the one who encouraged me to live a little," I reminded her. "You said Simon didn't deserve explanations." "I said a lot of things," Maya replied coldly. "But I never told you to use joint credit cards to buy gifts for your boyfriend or to bring him to family dinners. That was all you, Ligeia." The line went dead. My best friend, my confidant, the person who'd supported my affair from the beginning, had just abandoned me. I tried calling my mother next, but the conversation didn't go much better. "Oh, honey," Mum said when I explained the situation. "How did it get this bad?" "Simon's being vindictive," I said. "He's trying to destroy me because his ego can't handle the truth about our marriage." "What truth is that?" Mom asked quietly. "That he neglected me for years, that he took me for granted, that he drove me to seek attention elsewhere." "Ligeia," Mum's voice was gentle but firm, "did you have an affair?" The direct question caught me off guard. It's complicated." "It's not complicated, sweetheart. Either you were faithful to your marriage vows or you weren't." "Marriage is more than just fidelity," I protested. "What about emotional support? What about making your spouse feel valued and desired?" "Those things matter," Mum agreed, "but they don't justify betrayal, and they certainly don't justify using family money to fund an affair." After hanging up, I sat alone in my kitchen, surrounded by legal documents that painted me as a manipulative, unfaithful wife and negligent mother. For the first time since this whole thing began, I wondered if that's exactly what I'd become. The court hearing was scheduled for the following month. Simon's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen, had requested an expedited hearing due to concerns about Ava's emotional well-being. I hired my own attorney, but he was honest about my chances. "Your husband has built a very strong case," he told me during our consultation. "The evidence of infidelity is overwhelming, and the financial records show a pattern of deception that won't play well with a judge." "What about his emotional neglect?" I asked. "Doesn't that count for anything?" "Even if we could prove emotional neglect, which would be difficult, it doesn't excuse adultery or financial dishonesty. The court's primary concern will be what's best for your daughter." The night before the hearing, I tried calling Felix for support, but his number had been disconnected. When I drove to his apartment, I found it empty, a "for rent" sign in the window. My lover, the man who'd promised to worship me, who'd written poetry about my beauty, had disappeared without a word. I sat in my car outside his empty apartment and finally understood the magnitude of what I'd lost. My marriage, my friendships, my family's respect, my financial security, all sacrificed for a man who'd vanished the moment things got complicated. The hearing itself was a nightmare. Simon sat at the plaintiff's table, looking calm and professional, flanked by his lawyer and his brother Paul. I watched as Patricia Chen methodically presented evidence of my affair, my lies, my financial deception. Photos of Felix and me at restaurants, copies of romantic texts, credit card statements highlighting every gift I'd bought him. Mrs. Carruthers used marital funds to purchase expensive gifts for her lover, Patricia told the judge. She lied repeatedly to her husband about her whereabouts and activities. She brought her affair partner into the family home, exposing their 8-year-old daughter to inappropriate situations. When my lawyer tried to present evidence of Simon's emotional distance, it fell flat. Work schedules and busy periods didn't compare to documented adultery and financial betrayal. The worst moment came when Ava was brought in for a brief interview with the judge. My daughter, dressed in her best dress and looking terrified, answered questions about her living situation with heartbreaking honesty. "I want to live with Daddy," she said in a small voice when asked about custody preferences. "He reads to me at night and helps with my homework. Mummy's been sad and angry a lot lately." The judge's decision was swift and decisive. Simon was granted primary custody, with me receiving supervised visitation every other weekend. The house would be sold, with proceeds divided according to each party's financial contribution, minus the money I'd spent on Felix, which would be deducted from my share. As the courtroom emptied, I found myself alone except for Simon, who was gathering his papers at the plaintiff's table. For a moment, our eyes met across the room. "Simon," I began, not sure what I wanted to say. He looked at me with the same steady gaze I'd once found boring, but now I could see the pain beneath his composure. "Goodbye, Ligeia," he said quietly, then walked past me without another word. I stood in the empty courtroom, surrounded by the wreckage of my choices, and finally understood what I'd thrown away. Simon hadn't been boring or inattentive. He'd been stable, loyal, and devoted to our family. He'd worked long hours to provide for us, attended every school event despite his busy schedule, and loved me faithfully for 10 years. And I'd repaid that devotion by betraying him in the most intimate way possible, in our own bed, with our own money, while he worked to support the family I was busy destroying. The irony wasn't lost on me. In seeking to feel desired and important, I'd made myself into exactly what Simon's lawyer had painted me as: a selfish, manipulative woman who'd prioritized her own gratification over her family's well-being. As I walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, I realized that Simon had won more than a legal victory. He'd reclaimed his dignity, protected his daughter, and moved forward with his life while I remained trapped in the consequences of my choices. Felix was gone. Maya wouldn't return my calls. My mother spoke to me with disappointment rather than support. And Simon, steady, reliable Simon, had proven that even the quietest person could be formidable when pushed too far. I'd used my husband's bed to sleep with my boyfriend, thinking I was claiming some kind of power or independence. Instead, I'd handed Simon all the evidence he needed to walk away from our marriage with his integrity intact and our daughter safe in his care. He never came back to our house, and now I understood why. There was nothing left worth returning to.